November 1942. The North Atlantic wasn't just dangerous, it was a graveyard. And I don't mean that in a poetic sense. I mean a literal, cold, pitch-black cemetery stretching across thousands of miles of open water. Since the war began, more than 3,000 Allied ships had been sent straight to the bottom by German U-boats. Think about that for a second. 3,000 ships. Millions of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, weapons, vehicles, everything the Allies needed to keep fighting just sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Completely useless. And every single week, hundreds of Allied sailors were dying out there. Some drowned the second a torpedo ripped their ship open. Others spent days slowly freezing to death in lifeboats. And some, the worst cases, were burned alive when oil slicks on the surface caught fire and turned the ocean into a wall of flames. The lucky ones died fast. The unlucky ones had time to think about it. Hitler's U-boats, what the Germans called the Wolves, were hunting in coordinated packs. And they were absolutely devastating Allied convoys with a kind of terrifying efficiency that felt almost surgical. A single wolf pack of 5 or 6 submarines could wipe out an entire convoy of 30 or 40 merchant ships in one night. One night, the U-boat commanders had refined their tactics into a near-perfect science. Surface at night, when radar couldn't easily pick them up. Slip into the convoy formation, where escorts couldn't fire without hitting friendly ships. Launch torpedoes at point-blank range. Then dive and vanish before anyone could respond. Winston Churchill, a man who wasn't afraid of much, actually wrote after the war that the Battle of the Atlantic was the one thing that genuinely frightened him throughout the entire conflict. And he had every reason to be scared. Britain was an island. Everything it needed to survive, food, weapons, supplies, had to be shipped across the Atlantic from America. If Germany could cut that lifeline, Britain would starve. The Soviet Union would collapse without American aid. The entire Allied war machine would grind to a halt, and Hitler would win not on the battlefield, but by attrition. The math was brutally simple. If U-boats could sink ships faster than Allied shipyards could build them, Germany wins. If the Allies could build and deliver faster than the U-boats could destroy, the Allies win. In late 1942, Germany was winning that equation. Into this nightmare sailed the USS Doyle. Now, the Doyle wasn't a massive battleship or some imposing warship. It was a destroyer escort, a relatively small vessel built for one specific purpose: keep merchant ships alive long enough to reach their destination. It had sonar for detecting submarines, depth charges for attacking them, and a suite of guns for surface combat. In November 1942, the Doyle was assigned to escort a convoy of 47 merchant vessels making the crossing from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way to North Africa. These ships were carrying supplies for Operation Torch, the major Allied invasion of French North Africa that would be commanded by a then relatively unknown American general named George S. Patton. The cargo was critical: tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, medicine, fuel, everything an invading army needs to survive in the desert. This convoy was valuable, which meant the U-boats were already hunting it. Among the Doyle's crew of 186 men was a 22-year-old sailor from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, named Leonard Jackson. He'd grown up in a segregated neighborhood, gone to segregated schools, and learned pretty early in life that the color of his skin was going to determine what doors were open to him and which ones weren't. Jackson had actually enlisted in the Navy back in early 1941 before Pearl Harbor, before America was even officially in the war. He signed up for the same reasons millions of young men did: a sense of duty, a hunger for adventure, and honestly, a shot at something better than what was waiting for him back home. He pictured himself manning guns, working radar, maybe even becoming an officer if he proved himself capable enough. The Navy had very different plans. In 1942, the United States Navy was rigidly segregated, not just in practice, but by official policy. Black sailors were restricted almost entirely to what was called the steward's branch. That meant serving food, cleaning officers' quarters, working in kitchens, handling laundry, support roles. Nothing more. They were explicitly barred from combat positions. They couldn't operate weapons. They couldn't become officers. The official stance shared by much of white America at the time was that black men simply didn't have the intelligence, the discipline, or the courage required for combat. So Leonard Jackson, who had scored high on his entrance exams and specifically expressed interest in gunnery, was assigned to the Doyle's galley. Cook third class. His job was to prepare meals, wash dishes, keep the kitchen running, and stay out of the way when actual combat operations were happening, and by all accounts, he was good at it. The crew appreciated his cooking. He had a genuine talent for making the Navy's notoriously bland rations taste better than they had any right to. He showed up on time. He worked hard. And he never complained about the endless hours of chopping, scrubbing, and serving meals to men who barely acknowledged his existence. But here's the thing about Leonard Jackson that nobody paid attention to. He was observant. Deeply, quietly, methodically observant. During the months the Doyle spent at sea, the ship ran constant battle drills. General quarters would sound, and every single crew member would race to their assigned combat station. Jackson's station was below decks, a sealed compartment where non-combat personnel were supposed to wait out attacks in relative safety. But to get there, he had to walk through the main deck, right past the gun crews. And Jackson watched. Every single time. He watched the gunners on the 20mm anti-aircraft guns, fast-firing weapons, designed to shoot down enemy aircraft, but effective against surface targets too. He watched how they loaded the circular drum magazines. He watched how they aimed tracking targets through simple metal ring sights. He watched how they managed the recoil by leaning into the weapon instead of fighting it. He watched how they led moving targets, firing not at where something was, but where it was going to be by the time the bullets got there. Nobody had trained Jackson on any of this. Nobody had given him permission to learn. He wasn't even supposed to be thinking about it. But he had eyes, and he had a mind that absorbed and retained information during hundreds of drills. While delivering coffee and sandwiches to the gun crews during breaks, he had slowly and completely memorized every procedure without ever once consciously deciding to. The Doyle's officers had absolutely no idea their cook had effectively taught himself the ship's weapon systems. They never asked. Why would they? And Jackson never volunteered it. What would have been the point? A black cook learning gunnery was pointless. He would never, ever be allowed to actually use that knowledge. Navy regulations were crystal clear on that. But here's the thing about the ocean. It doesn't care about regulations. And on November 14th, 1942, 3 days out from the North African coast, it was about to prove that in the most dramatic way imaginable, the convoy had been relatively lucky for most of the crossing. Bad weather, miserable for everyone on board, had actually worked in their favor, because U-boats struggled to operate effectively in rough seas, and choppy water made it nearly impossible to spot targets through a periscope. The merchant ships had been scattered by storms more than once, but the escorts had managed to keep the formation mostly intact and moving east. But as they closed in on Africa, the weather changed, the ocean went flat, almost glassy. It was stunning to look at, and absolutely terrifying to think about, because calm seas meant perfect hunting conditions for U-boats. The Doyle's sonar operators were listening constantly. Lookouts swept the horizon with binoculars for hours on end. Officers pored over intelligence reports on known U-boat positions. The entire crew was wound tight, knowing an attack could come at any second. Leonard Jackson kept to his routine. He was up at 4:45 in the morning to start breakfast. He served meals in shifts. He cleaned the galley. He started prepping for the next meal. His world was stoves, pots, geeves, and an endless pile of potatoes. He was somewhere around his 200th potato of the day when another cook asked him if he was scared. Of what? Jackson said. The U-boats. We're sitting ducks out here. Jackson thought about it for a moment and shrugged. If a torpedo has my name on it, there's nothing I can do about it. And if it doesn't, why worry? It was the kind of fatalistic calm that helped sailors keep their heads in the face of constant, invisible danger. But there was something else Jackson was thinking that he didn't say out loud. If this ship gets hit, I'm not dying below decks. Not hiding in a sealed compartment waiting for the hull to cave in. If I'm going to die tonight, I want to be doing something. He had no idea how soon he'd have the chance to prove exactly that. Here is part 2 of the rewritten script. It was 2:47 in the morning on November 14th when everything fell apart at once. Jackson was in the galley making coffee for the pre-dawn watch change. The ship was quiet, just the steady hum of engines and the soft sound of water moving along the hull. Most of the crew was asleep. A handful of men stood watch at their stations. It was the kind of dead, heavy silence that settles over a ship in the early hours, when alertness starts to slip and minds start to drift. And then the explosion hit. It didn't sound like an explosion at first, it felt like one. The blast wave slammed into the Doyle like a physical punch, shaking the entire destroyer from bow to stern. Jackson was thrown hard against the galley counter. Hot coffee splashed across the deck. Pots and pans crashed down from their hooks. The lights flickered, but somehow held. For one surreal moment, there was total silence, every man on that ship trying to process what had just happened. Then the alarm bells started. That harsh, insistent clanging that every sailor dreaded. Battle stations. Jackson ran to the nearest porthole and looked out. About 800 meters away, one of the convoy's tankers, a massive vessel loaded with thousands of gallons of fuel oil, was dying in real time. A German torpedo had struck it amidships, tearing open its cargo tanks. Burning oil was spreading across the surface of the water, turning the ocean into a lake of fire. The tanker's crew were jumping overboard, choosing to take their chances in the burning sea rather than stay aboard a ship that could detonate at any second. The sky lit up in a deep orange glow, so bright it physically hurt to look at. The tanker was silhouetted against its own funeral pyre, listing to starboard, its back broken. All hands to battle stations. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. Surface and subsurface contacts. Multiple U-boats in the area. Now, according to every regulation Jackson had ever been given, according to his training, according to every direct order he had ever received, he should have gone below decks immediately. That was his assignment. That was the rule. The non-combat personnel shelter. Wait it out. Stay out of the way. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. He didn't do it. Something pulled him upward instead of down. Maybe it was instinct, some primal refusal to be trapped below the waterline in a steel coffin if the ship took another hit. Maybe it was the same quiet defiance that had carried his ancestors through slavery and his parents through the daily grind of Jim Crow. Maybe it was just what he'd told himself that afternoon. If I'm going to die, I want to see the sky. Whatever it was. Jackson ran up the stairs to the main deck, moving against the current of men rushing to their combat stations. Nobody stopped him. In the chaos, nobody even noticed him. He burst out into the open air just in time for the second torpedo to hit. This one struck the Doyle itself. It detonated at the stern, right where the ammunition for the rear guns was stored. The blast was catastrophic. A column of fire and debris shot 50 feet into the air. The entire back end of the destroyer buckled and twisted. Men were thrown overboard by the shock wave. Others were killed instantly by shrapnel. Jackson was knocked flat onto the deck. His ears were ringing. His vision went blurry. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The explosion had knocked the air completely out of his lungs. When he finally managed to draw a breath, it tasted like smoke and burning metal. The Doyle was badly hurt. Fires burned at multiple points along the deck. The rear 20mm gun position had been completely destroyed. Men were screaming for medics. Officers were shouting orders. Damage control teams were sprinting across the deck with hoses and fire extinguishers, trying desperately to keep the fires away from the fuel tanks and any remaining ammunition storage. Jackson pulled himself to his feet, and his cook's uniform white just an hour ago was soaked through with seawater and blood. He wasn't even sure if it was his own or someone else's. The deck was slick with oil and things he didn't want to look at too closely. The organized, disciplined naval vessel he'd served on for months had transformed, in a matter of minutes, into something out of a nightmare. And then he saw it. 20 feet away, one of the midship's 20mm gun positions was completely unmanned. The gunner was lying on the deck nearby. He wasn't getting up. The weapon itself was intact, barrel pointing uselessly at the sky. Ammunition drum still loaded, just sitting there. Jackson looked at that gun. He looked at the burning sea surrounding the convoy, where U-boats were circling like sharks. He looked at the men running past him, fighting to save their ship, fighting back against an enemy they couldn't even see. And Leonard Jackson made a decision that would change his life and save hundreds of others. He ran to the gun position, climbed onto the platform, and grabbed the weapon's twin handles. The metal was cold against his palms. The gun smelled of oil and cordite. Through the simple ring sight, he could see the ocean lit up by the fires from the dying tanker. So, he had never fired this weapon. He had never been authorized to touch it. He had never received a single minute of official instruction on how it worked. But he had watched. For months, he had watched. He knew how to release the safety lever on the left side. He knew how to aim, put the target in the center of the ring, and track it smoothly. He knew how to fire, squeeze the trigger on the right handle. He knew how to manage the recoil, lean into it. Don't fight it. His hands moved through the sequence like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Safety off, sight clear. Ammunition drum confirmed loaded 200 rounds of 20mm high explosive incendiary shells, each one capable of punching through light armor. He was ready. He didn't have to wait long. The Doyle's searchlights were cutting across the water, hunting for the submarines that had just attacked the convoy. U-boats typically struck at night from the surface, where they were faster and harder to track than when submerged. Gimao. They'd position themselves among the convoy ships, launch torpedoes, then either dive or run on the surface to escape before the escorts could organize a response. But that night, one of the U-boat commanders made a mistake. Maybe he was emboldened by the chaos his torpedoes had just created. Maybe he was eager to reload and fire again before the escorts could get organized. Whatever the reason, he decided to surface and recharge his torpedo tubes 300 meters from the Doyle. A German Type 7C U-boat broke the surface like a breaching whale. Water cascaded off its hull as it rose conning tower first, then the deck gun, then the long cylindrical body of the submarine itself. Hatches flew open, and crew members scrambled out onto the deck, racing to reload the forward torpedo tubes. Standard German procedure: surface briefly, reload fast, dive again before the enemy can react. Under normal circumstances, with a disorganized enemy, it was risky but manageable. The submarine would be exposed for maybe 2 minutes, maybe less. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Leonard Jackson wasn't a normal gun crew. The Doyle's searchlight found the submarine, pinning it in a cone of brilliant white light. Through his sight, Jackson watched the German sailors on deck shield their eyes from the glare, temporarily blinded, shouting to each other in a panic. Jackson opened fire. The 20mm cannon erupted in his hands, bucking and shaking as it hammered out shells at 450 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds every 5th shell, coated with phosphorus, to burn bright and mark the flight path streaked across the water in a glowing arc, showing Jackson exactly where his rounds were going. His first burst went high. Shells passed over the conning tower and splashed into the ocean beyond. But he corrected instantly, walking his fire down exactly the way he'd seen trained gunners do it during drills. The second burst tore across the submarine's deck, shells sparking and ricocheting off steel plating. German sailors dove for hatches, abandoning the reload operation entirely, scrambling to get below before the next burst found them. The U-boat commander screamed orders to dive, get under the surface before this unexpected attack could do worse damage. But Jackson had already adjusted his aim. He wasn't targeting the conning tower or the exposed crew. Those were valuable targets, but heavily armored. He aimed lower. He aimed at the waterline, where the submarine's pressure hull was thinner, where even 20mm shells could penetrate if they hit at the right angle. His third burst found exactly that spot. High explosive shells slammed into the U-boat's hull just above the waterline, punching through and detonating inside. Each individual explosion was small, 20mm rounds don't carry much charge. But they didn't need to be large. They just needed to make holes. Holes that let the ocean in. The U-boat's dive became frantic and desperate. The commander knew his boat was damaged, but didn't yet know how badly. He ordered emergency dive procedures, hoping to get below the surface before more damage occurred. The submarine's bow tilted sharply downward as ballast tanks flooded, but water was simultaneously pouring through the holes Jackson had torn in the pressure hull. The U-boat wasn't diving in any controlled sense. It was sinking stern first, at an angle that kept getting steeper. German sailors were still scrambling down the conning tower hatch when the ocean swallowed them. The U-boat's stern went under. Then the midsection, then the conning tower, then the very tip of the periscope cutting through the water like a shark's fin. And then nothing. It never came back up. Later analysis would determine that the U-boat had taken on too much water too fast, unable to control its descent. It plunged past its maximum safe depth and imploded under pressure at approximately 300 meters down. All 44 crew members died instantly when the hull collapsed, the ocean pressure creating their tomb in a fraction of a second. But Jackson didn't know any of that yet. He didn't have time to think about it, because the battle wasn't over. The sea was still a chaos of burning oil, scattered merchant ships, and searchlight beams cutting through thick smoke. And then a second U-boat appeared. This one surfaced on the opposite side of the Doyle, about 400 meters out. It was bigger than the first, a Type 9 built for long-range operations, carrying more torpedoes and a larger crew. Its commander had been watching the engagement, calculating his attack. When he saw what had just happened to his fellow U-boat, he made a quick decision. Surface completely. Bring the deck gun to bear. Destroy this troublesome escort before it could kill another submarine. It was an aggressive move, a bold move. Against most opponents, it might have worked. Leonard Jackson was not most opponents. The Type 9 rose from the dark water like something prehistoric, 76 meters long, one of Germany's most capable submarines, designed to operate far from home ports, carrying 22 torpedoes and a crew of 58 battle-hardened sailors. The commander had already done the math. The American destroyer was already damaged from the torpedo hit. A few well-placed artillery rounds would finish it off. What he hadn't accounted for was the response time. He assumed whoever had just destroyed the first U-boat was a trained Navy gunner who would need time to swing his weapon around and reacquire a target on the opposite side of the ship. Leonard Jackson wasn't bound by any of that. The moment he saw the second submarine breaking the surface, he was already moving. He grabbed the traversing handles and spun the 20mm gun on its mount, pivoting the barrel in a smooth arc across the deck. The movements were purely instinctive now, months of unconscious observation translated directly into action. The Type 9 was still rising, water still streaming off its hull, hatches just beginning to crack open when Jackson opened fire. His first burst caught the conning tower, shells sparking off the armored structure. German sailors emerging from the forward hatch were cut down before they fully understood what was happening. The U-boat commander inside screamed for an immediate dive. But his deck gun crew, who were supposed to be manning their weapon by now, were dead. Jackson walked his fire down from the conning tower along the deck, methodically sweeping the submarine's length. But the real damage came when he concentrated fire on the top of the conning tower, specifically the periscope and radio antenna. These were critical systems, and they were lightly protected because they needed to extend and retract. The 20mm rounds shattered the periscope housing, destroyed the hydraulics, and turned the radio antenna into twisted scrap metal in a matter of seconds. The U-boat's eyes and ears were gone. Inside the conning tower, the commander was getting damage reports from every direction. Periscope destroyed, radio destroyed, multiple hull breaches, casualties on deck. He had seconds to decide stay up and fight back with the deck gun, or dive blind and hope to escape. He chose to dive. Emergency dive. All hands below. The submarine's bow tilted sharply downward, but the damage was too extensive. Jackson's fire had punched through the outer hull in too many places. Water was flooding compartments that should have been bone dry. At 50 meters, the commander tried to level off. The submarine refused. It kept tilting, kept accelerating downward. At 100 meters, alarms were screaming. They were approaching maximum safe depth. The hull groaned under the building pressure. At 150 meters, rivets began popping. At 200 meters, the Type 9 U-boat imploded. The pressure hull designed to withstand up to 230 meters when intact failed catastrophically when compromised by gunfire and an uncontrolled descent. The collapse happened in milliseconds. All 58 men aboard died instantly. They didn't have time to scream. One moment they were alive, fighting to save their boat. The next, they simply ceased to exist. Above on the Doyle's deck, Jackson saw the bubbles and debris rising to the surface where the submarine had disappeared. 2 submarines gone in under 15 minutes. His ammunition drum was nearly empty. His hands were numb. His shoulder ached from the sustained recoil. His ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear anything else. He should have stopped. Should have called for a relief gunner. Should have gone back below decks where he belonged. But the battle still wasn't over. And somewhere out in that darkness, more U-boats were still circling. Jackson ejected the spent drum and reached for a fresh one from the ready rack beside the mount. Hands working automatically. Align the drum. Push it firmly into place. Pull the charging handle. Release the safety. Ready. The Doyle's captain, Commander William Harris, had been fighting his own battle on the bridge, trying to hold his damaged ship together, coordinate damage control, maintain position with the convoy, and get some kind of coherent picture of what was even happening in all the chaos. But reports kept reaching him about the unmanned midship gun position that was somehow still firing, about submarines going down, about someone who absolutely should not have been there doing things that weren't supposed to be possible. Harris grabbed binoculars and looked toward the position. Through the smoke and spray, he could make out a figure in what had once been a white cook's uniform, now soaked through with blood and oil, calmly manning the 20mm gun. "Who the hell is that?" Harris demanded. Nobody had an answer, but before he could investigate further, a lookout screamed. "Submarine surfacing, close, 200 meters, bearing 090. Everyone on the bridge turned. 200 meters. Barely the length of 2 football fields. At that range, if the U-boat got its deck gun operational, it could tear the Doyle apart with relative ease. The 3rd U-boat was making a desperate, all-or-nothing gambit. Its commander had just watched 2 of his wolf pack destroyed in rapid succession by this supposedly helpless escort. He'd seen the speed and accuracy of the fire. He understood now that something unusual was happening on that ship. So he decided to go straight at it. Surface close. Surface fast. Get the deck gun up and firing before the Americans could react. Put enough shells into that destroyer to sink it, or at least knock it out completely. It was the kind of aggressive, committed tactic that sometimes works against a disorganized or poorly trained enemy. It required speed, surprise, and above all, getting your gun crew on deck and shooting before the other side could respond. The U-boat broke the surface at high speed, water exploding in all directions. The conning tower hatch flew open and German sailors poured out, sprinting toward the deck gun with real efficiency. They were fast. They were trained. They were driven by the deaths of their comrades and the very clear understanding that their own survival depended on destroying that ship in Samt. They just weren't fast enough. Jackson had already spotted the submarine the moment it started to surface. At 200 meters, it was closer than either of the previous 2, but closer also meant easier to hit. Less distance to travel. Less time for the target to maneuver. Jackson had the gun trained on it before the first German sailor had fully cleared the conning tower hatch. His finger was already tightening on the trigger. By this point, he'd stopped hesitating. Don't wait. Don't second guess. Fire first, and keep firing until the target is gone or the ammunition runs out. The U-boat's commander hauled himself through the hatch, mouth opening to shout orders to his deck gun crew. He never got the words out. Jackson's first burst caught him directly in the chest. The German commander was thrown backward into the conning tower, his body blocking the hatch, creating a human obstacle that prevented the sailors below from getting to the deck. Jackson kept firing, traversing slightly, sweeping the conning tower area, cutting down anyone who tried to push through. Then he shifted aim to the deck gun itself. Even unmanned, it represented a threat if anyone managed to reach it. 20mm shells hammered into the gun mount, destroyed the traversing mechanism, bent the barrel. Useless. Below decks, the U-boat's executive officer faced an impossible situation. They couldn't surface the deck was a kill zone. They couldn't dive too close to the American ship. They'd be rammed or depth charged. They couldn't fight, their gun was destroyed, and their commander was dead. That left one option. A white cloth, actually, someone's undershirt appeared through the conning tower hatch, waving frantically. A voice shouted in heavily accented English, "We surrender. We surrender. Please stop shooting." Jackson's finger stayed on the trigger, but he didn't fire. He kept the gun trained directly on the submarine, watching for any sign this was a trick. It wasn't. Slowly, carefully, German sailors began climbing out of the hatch with their hands raised, stepping over the bodies of their dead crewmates, filing onto the deck, facing the Doyle. Commander Harris ordered a boarding party over. 11 German sailors were pulled aboard the Doyle, all that remained alive from a crew that had started the night with 44 men. The U-boat itself damaged, abandoned. Ballast tanks flooding began to sink slowly beneath the surface. Jackson watched it go down, his hands still gripping the gun handles, his entire body shaking now that the adrenaline was draining away, and the reality of what had just happened was beginning to actually land. 3 U-boats, 30 minutes, from the first engagement to the last. One man, with a weapon he had never once been formally trained to operate. The ammunition drum was empty again. Here is part 3 of the rewritten script. That's where Commander Harris found him, slumped against the gun mount, back against the steel, legs finally giving out underneath him. The deck around the 20mm position was carpeted with empty shell casings, hundreds of them, glinting in the orange light, still pouring off the burning tanker. The gun barrel was still warm, a thin ribbon of smoke curling up from it into the night air. And sitting beside it, wearing a blood-soaked cook's uniform, was a black sailor who had absolutely no authorization to be anywhere near that weapon. Commander William Harris stood there for a long moment, just trying to make sense of what he was looking at. Jackson struggled to his feet, coming to attention as best he could. His legs were unsteady. His hands were still trembling. Jackson. "Sir." "Cook 3rd class." Harris looked at him, then at the gun, then out at the ocean, where 3 spreading patches of oil and debris marked the graves of 3 German submarines. He looked back at Jackson. "Cook," he repeated slowly, like the word had stopped making sense. "You're a cook." "Yes, sir. And you just destroyed 3 U-boats." Yes, sir. I think so, sir." Harris went quiet for a long moment. His mind was trying to do 2 things at once: reconcile what Navy regulations said was possible with the completely undeniable evidence in front of him. Finally, he asked the only question that actually mattered. "Where did you learn to operate this weapon?" Jackson hesitated. The honest answer could get him court-martialed. Being somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Learning things he had no authorization to know. But lying to his commanding officer felt worse. "I watched, sir, during drills. I never touched the guns, but I watched the gunners every time I came through this deck. I memorized what they did. I didn't think I'd ever actually need to use it, but I couldn't help learning." Harris stared at him for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. A short, sharp, humorless bark of a laugh, the kind that comes not from amusement, but from sheer disbelief and a kind of desperate admiration. "You watched, you memorized, and then you went out there and killed 3 submarines." Harris shook his head slowly. "Son, do you have any idea what you just did? Those U-boats would have torn this convoy apart. Dozens of ships sunk. Thousands of tons of supplies lost. Hundreds, maybe thousands of men dead. You saved this entire convoy." Jackson didn't know what to say to that. He'd been fighting to survive, to protect his ship. The larger scale of what had actually happened hadn't fully hit him yet. Harris made a decision on the spot. You stay right here. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I need to write this up, and I need to figure out how on earth I'm going to explain it to my superiors. Harris's report moved up the Navy's chain of command like a rocket. A black cook destroying 3 U-boats in 30 minutes. It was unprecedented. It was extraordinary. And it was also deeply, profoundly uncomfortable for a military establishment built on the firm assumption that black servicemen were not capable of handling combat roles. The report landed on the desk of the admiral commanding North African naval operations within 2 days. It reached Eisenhower's headquarters within 3, and within a week, it reached the ears of George S. Patton. Patton was in North Africa at the time, preparing his forces for the push into Tunisia. When a Navy liaison officer casually mentioned the incident during dinner at headquarters, the way you'd share an interesting footnote, a curious oddity at the edge of a much bigger story. A black cook sank 3 U-boats. Patton stopped him mid-sentence, eyes narrowing. 1 man, 3 submarines. Yes, General Leonard Jackson. They're considering an accommodation, but there are complications. Patton knew exactly what those complications were. He'd spent his entire military career fighting the Army's institutional racism. Arguing, loudly and repeatedly, that combat effectiveness had nothing whatsoever to do with skin color. That courage and skill were not racial characteristics. He'd been overruled. He'd been ignored. He'd sometimes been mocked for those views, but he had never stopped believing them. Where is this man now? Still aboard the USS Doyle, sir? The ship is docked in Casablanca for repairs after the torpedo damage. Patton stood up from the table. Get my jeep ready. I'm going to meet this cook. His staff officers exchanged glances. Patton visiting a Navy vessel wasn't unusual. He coordinated with naval forces regularly. But making a personal trip to meet an enlisted cook, that was unusual even by Patton standards. Sir, the Navy can send him to you if you want to interview him. One officer offered carefully. No, Patton said. If a man saves hundreds of lives and wins a significant tactical victory, a general can damn well go to meet him. Get the jeep. The next morning, Patton's vehicle rolled up to the Casablanca docks where the Doyle was moored. The damage was visible from the dock, the stern blackened and twisted. Repair crews welding new steel plates. A work barge pumping out flooded compartments alongside. Word that a 3-star general had arrived spread through the ship in seconds. Sailors scrambled to look presentable. Officers rushed to greet him. Commander Harris met Patton at the gangway with a sharp salute. General Patton. Sir, this is an unexpected honor. Where's Jackson? Patton said, skipping everything else. The cook who killed those U-boats. Harris paused. Sir, he's in the galley. Working. I can have him brought to the wardroom if you'd like. Take me to the galley. Not a request. Harris led Patton through the ship's narrow corridors, past sailors pressing themselves flat against the walls to let the general through, down into the cramped space where the crew's meals were prepared. Leonard Jackson was standing at a counter peeling potatoes. A large metal bucket beside him was already half full. He was focused, hands moving with the kind of practiced, automatic efficiency you develop after peeling your 10,000th potato. He didn't notice Patton until the general's shadow fell across his workstation. Jackson looked up, saw the 3 stars on Patton's helmet, nearly dropped his knife. He started to snap to attention, but Patton waved him off. At ease, sailor. Keep working. I want to talk to you while you do what you do. Jackson resumed peeling, though his hands weren't quite as steady as they'd been a moment ago. Sir, what can I do for you? Sir. Patton pulled up a stool and sat down, close enough that Jackson could catch the scent of the general's cologne mixed with cigar smoke. I want to hear it from you. What happened out there? Your own words. So Jackson told him, haltingly at first. Then with growing steadiness, as Patton listened, without a single interruption, the torpedo hits. The chaos on deck. The unmanned gun. The 3 submarines. He described how he'd learned by watching. How he'd fired, based on observation and instinct rather than any formal training. When he finished, Patton was quiet, watching Jackson's hands work another potato in slow, methodical circles. "How many potatoes do you peel in a day, son?" The question caught Jackson completely off guard. "Sir, maybe 200. Depends on the menu." 200 potatoes, Patton repeated. "And nobody taught you how to peel potatoes, did they? They just handed you a knife and a bucket and expected you to figure it out." "Yes, sir." "Pretty much." Patton leaned forward. "That's how you learn to operate that gun, isn't it?" "Same process. Watch. Learn. Practice in your mind until the movements are automatic." "I suppose so, sir." Patton stood. He turned to face the cluster of officers who had quietly crowded into the galley entrance to watch this strange scene unfold. "Gentlemen," he said, "you are looking at what a real soldier looks like. Not someone who was trained for it. Not someone who was authorized. Not someone who was expected to fight. Someone who saw what needed to be done and did it. Someone who improvised, who attacked, who won." He looked back at Jackson. "The Navy is probably going to give you a medal and then send you straight back to peeling potatoes. Because that's how institutions think. They can't accept that their assumptions might be wrong. Yow. They can't bring themselves to admit that a black cook might be as capable as any white gunner more capable, based on what you just proved." Patton reached down and unbuckled one of his pistols, the famous Colt 45 with ivory grips that he'd carried through 2 wars, through Mexico, through the First World War, through every fight he'd ever been in. He held it out to Jackson. "I collect warriors, son. Men who understand that courage doesn't come from rank or training or permission. It comes from inside. You are one of the finest I have ever encountered." Jackson stared at the pistol. His hands were still holding a half-peeled potato and a knife. "Sir, I can't accept." "Yes, you can. And you will." Patton's voice was firm, but not harsh. "You earned this." Jackson set the potato and the knife down with trembling hands and accepted the weapon. It was heavier than he expected. The ivory grips smooth and warm. "General, sir, I don't know what to say." Patton was already turning to leave. He paused at the galley entrance and looked back over his shoulder. "Don't say anything. Just remember who you are. Not a cook, not a black man in a white man's navy. A warrior, one of the best. And when this war is over, don't let anyone tell you any different." He took 2 steps and stopped again. "Oh, and Jackson." "Yes, sir. Those potatoes aren't going to peel themselves. Get back to work. And then George S." Patton walked out of the galley, leaving behind a cook holding a general's pistol and trying very hard not to cry. The aftermath came slowly, the way these things always do inside large institutions. The Navy awarded Jackson the Navy Cross, the 2nd highest decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. But the ceremony was quiet, almost secretive, conducted in Casablanca with no press present, no photographers, no public recognition of any kind. The citation was carefully worded to acknowledge exceptional valor in combat, without dwelling on the rather embarrassing fact that an untrained cook had outperformed what most professional gunners could ever have hoped to achieve. After the ceremony, Jackson was returned to his duties as a cook. The Navy made no effort to retrain him as a gunner, no push to commission him as an officer, no attempt whatsoever to utilize the very obvious combat ability he had just demonstrated to the entire chain of command. He spent the rest of the war in galleys, peeling potatoes, preparing meals, serving coffee to men who sometimes had no idea they were being waited on by one of the most effective U-boat killers in the history of naval warfare. Jackson never complained about it. He'd done what he set out to do: survive the war, serve his country, prove to himself more than anyone that he was as capable as any man, regardless of what the regulations said. The Navy Cross was meaningful. Patton's pistol was something else entirely. But the real prize was the knowledge of what he'd accomplished, what he'd proven. When the war ended in 1945, Leonard Jackson came home to Baton Rouge. He opened a small restaurant. Nothing elaborate, just good Southern cooking, served in a clean establishment where everyone was welcome regardless of the color of their skin. It did well enough to support him and the family he built with his high school sweetheart. He rarely talked about the war. When curious customers asked about the pistol mounted in a glass case on the wall, a Colt 45 with distinctive ivory grips, he would just smile and say, "A general gave me that because I cooked real good." Most people accepted that and moved on. But occasionally, someone who knew their military history would look more closely at that pistol, notice the markings, realize whose weapon it had been, and ask the obvious question. Jackson would just smile a little wider and say, "Like I said, I cooked real good, but late at night, when the restaurant was closed and he was alone with his thoughts, Jackson would sometimes take that pistol down from the wall and hold it, feel its weight, remember the night when he had been more than a cook, when he had been exactly what Patton had called him, a warrior." The official Navy history of the Battle of the Atlantic mentions the engagement of November 14th, 1942, in a single paragraph. 3 U-boats were destroyed by USS Doyle during convoy protection operations. Allied losses were minimal. It doesn't mention Leonard Jackson by name. It doesn't mention that all 3 submarines were destroyed by one man. It doesn't mention that the man was a cook with 0 formal gunnery training. But the German naval archives captured after the war tell a different story. U-boat commanders who survived other engagements and were interrogated by Allied intelligence spoke about November 14th with a kind of horrified, reluctant respect. They described a wolf pack wiped out in minutes by accurate, devastating fire from a single weapon. They couldn't understand how the Americans had reacted that fast, how they'd fired that accurately, how they'd killed that efficiently. The Allied interrogators knew. They'd read the reports. They knew about Leonard Jackson. But they never explained it to the German prisoners. Better to let them wonder. Better to let them be afraid. In 1987, Leonard Jackson died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 67. His funeral in Baton Rouge was attended by hundreds of people, family, friends, decades of loyal customers. The pastor delivered a moving eulogy about a good man who had served his country, raised his family, and given something real to his community. Only one person mentioned the war. Jackson's oldest son, speaking at the service, told a story his father had finally shared in his last days. "My father sank 3 German submarines in 30 minutes with a gun he had never been trained to use. When a general asked him how he did it, my father said he learned the same way he learned everything. By watching. By practicing. By refusing to accept that something was impossible just because someone said it was." He paused, looking at the flag-draped casket. The Navy gave him a medal. General Patton gave him a pistol. But what my father valued most was what Patton told him. "You're not a cook. You're a warrior." In a world that spent a lifetime trying to limit what he could be, one man saw him for exactly what he truly was. The Colt 45 with ivory grips was buried with Leonard Jackson, placed in the casket by his family. It had been his most prized possession for over 40 years. The physical proof that for one night in 1942, the rules didn't matter. The regulations didn't matter. The color of a man's skin didn't matter. All that mattered was what a man could do when everything was on the line. 3 submarines, 30 minutes, 200 potatoes, and an absolute refusal to die hiding below decks. Some stories don't need any exaggeration. They're extraordinary exactly as they happened.